December 19th, 1944. A cold, damp barracks at Verdun, France, heated by a single pot-bellied stove. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower has called an emergency conference of his senior commanders, Montgomery, Bradley, Patton, and his own intelligence chief, Major General Kenneth Strong, who has just finished briefing the room on the scale of the German breakthrough now tearing through the Ardennes. The silence that follows is, by every account from the room, oppressive. Eisenhower breaks it by reframing the catastrophe deliberately. The present situation, he says, is to be regarded as one of opportunity, not disaster. There will be only cheerful faces at this table. Patton grins and offers to let the Germans run all the way to Paris so the Allies can cut them off properly. Eisenhower turns to him with the actual question. "George, how quickly can you disengage Third Army from its current offensive and pivot north toward Bastogne?" Patton's answer stops the room. 3 divisions in 48 hours. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder laughs out loud. Turning an entire corps 90 degrees across more than 100 miles of icy winter roads inside 2 days is not the kind of thing any officer in that room had ever seen attempted, let alone accomplished. Eisenhower's own face reportedly flushes. "Don't be fatuous, George. Go that early without all 3 divisions properly staged, and you'll arrive piecemeal and be destroyed in detail." The skepticism in the room reflected a reasonable read of recent operational history rather than simple timidity. Third Army had been fully committed to an offensive of its own toward the Saar for weeks, with supply dumps, artillery survey data, and unit dispositions all oriented toward continuing that push into Germany. Redirecting an entire field army onto a perpendicular axis under winter conditions, with the roads already strained by existing traffic, was the kind of maneuver staff colleges of the period generally treated as a multi-week planning exercise rather than something attempted on 3 days' notice. Patton was not exaggerating, and he was not improvising. For 3 days, his intelligence officer, Colonel Oskar Koch, had been warning him the German buildup in the Ardennes looked like more than a local spoiling attack against the broader staff consensus that dismissed the possibility. Patton had quietly ordered 3 separate contingency plans drawn up for exactly this scenario, prepositioned fuel and ammunition along the most likely routes north, and was, by the time Eisenhower asked the question, already in a position to answer it with a working plan rather than a guess. Eisenhower gave him until December 22nd. This is the story of what those 3 days actually required. Not as a single triumphant number, but as a logistics problem solved at a scale and speed no army had previously attempted. Set against a siege 100-plus miles north, where 18,000 surrounded Americans were rationing artillery shells to 10 rounds per gun per day, and finding, in roughly equal measure, both the limits and the unexpected resources of an army that had been told to expect this exact kind of war, and had not actually rehearsed it. At 5:30 a.m. on December 16, 1944, 1,600 German artillery pieces opened simultaneously along an 80-mile front through the Ardennes, a concentration of violence on the Western Front not seen since the German offensives of 1940. Private First Class Robert Lecochman of the 99th Infantry Division recorded the moment in language that conveys the specific shock of an army that had genuinely been told the Germans were finished. The earth shaking, trees exploding into splinters, the air itself seeming to scream. This was Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, Hitler's last coordinated attempt to reverse the war's trajectory in the West. In near total secrecy, the Wehrmacht had assembled roughly 410,000 troops, some 1,400 tanks and assault guns, and 2,600 artillery pieces, moving the entire force through the dense Eifel forests at night under strict radio silence, using horse-drawn transport for part of the supply train specifically to avoid the engine noise Allied listening posts might have detected. The secrecy effort extended to denying German formation commanders themselves full knowledge of the plan until shortly before the attack, a deliberate compartmentalization that succeeded at preserving surprise, but also meant several subordinate units received their final objectives with less preparation time than the operation's ambition genuinely required. General Major Heinz Kokott, commanding the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, described the mood among his men in the hours before the attack as silent, breath freezing in the dark, fully aware that this represented Germany's last realistic opportunity rather than simply another offensive among many. The target was deliberately chosen. 4 American divisions, several new to combat or still recovering from earlier fighting, spread thin across genuinely difficult terrain that German planners judged the weakest sustained stretch of the entire Allied line. Tactical surprise was, by any measure, complete. Within hours, entire American units were overrun or in disorganized retreat. But the German operational plan carried one absolute, non-negotiable requirement: speed. 7 major roads converged of the small town of Bastogne, and German armor needed that junction within 48 hours of the attack's opening to maintain any realistic chance of reaching its ultimate objective, the port of Antwerp, 125 miles further west. Without Bastogne, the entire offensive's timetable collapsed, regardless of how much initial ground had been won elsewhere. General der Panzertruppe Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz commanded the 47th Panzer Corps assigned to take it, a genuinely formidable force on paper, built around the 2nd Panzer Division with 88 tanks and assault guns, the veteran Panzer Lehr Division with 57 tanks, and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division's roughly 17,000 infantry. Racing toward the same junction from the opposite direction was the 101st Airborne Division, resting at Mourmelon, France after 72 consecutive days of combat in Holland when the order arrived with no winter clothing issued and no time to prepare beyond grab your weapons and get on the trucks. December 17th, 9 p.m. The temperature had fallen to 14 degrees Fahrenheit as the first of roughly 380 trucks carrying the 101st Airborne rolled through the darkness toward Bastogne. Private Donald Burgett of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment recalled passing column after column of American troops moving the opposite direction, some without weapons, many without helmets, shouting warnings about the scale of German armor they had just escaped. The convoy stretched for miles with scarce maps and contradictory intelligence. What the men knew with certainty was that the junction had to be reached before German armor reached it first. The division's effective combat strength stood at roughly 11,840, 85 officers and 11,035 enlisted men across 4 parachute and glider infantry regiments, plus supporting artillery battalions. The decision to commit an airborne division, normally held in reserve specifically for vertical envelopment operations, to a conventional ground defense reflected the genuine absence of any better positioned reserve formation. SHAEF's available uncommitted reserves by mid-December consisted essentially of the 82nd and 101st Airborne, both still recovering from Holland, and the speed of the German breakthrough left no time to identify or move a more conventionally suited unit into position first. Leading elements of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment reached Bastogne at 11:30 p.m. on December 18th, beating the main German advance by a matter of hours rather than days. Team de Sobry, a combat team from the 10th Armored Division under Major William de Sobry, had already established a roadblock 3 miles north of town at Neuville and made first contact with German spearheads at dawn on December 19th. Sergeant William McCloskey, a tank commander with the team, described the fog that morning as thick enough to limit visibility to 50 yards before the deep rumble of German armor became audible, and the specific tactical problem a Panther presented when it finally emerged from the mist. American 75mm rounds bouncing off its frontal armor, forcing the defenders to let German tanks close to dangerously short range before engaging from the side, where the armor was thinner. The fighting at Neuville illustrated a pattern that recurs throughout the broader siege. A small, badly outnumbered American detachment trading space and casualties specifically to buy time for the larger defensive position to consolidate, rather than attempting to hold ground indefinitely. Team de Sobry held Neuville against the bulk of the 2nd Panzer Division for 48 hours, with just 15 Shermans, destroying 31 German tanks before withdrawal orders came through. De Sobry himself was severely wounded when a German shell struck his command post directly, but the delay he purchased mattered more than the position itself, since it gave the main perimeter around Bastogne roughly 2 additional days to organize before the full weight of von Luttwitz's corps arrived. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe arrived December 20th to take temporary command of the 101st Airborne in Maxwell Taylor's absence. An artillery officer by training, known specifically for an unflustered temperament that the coming week would test repeatedly. The improvised nature of the overall garrison command structure is itself worth noting. McAuliffe was commanding a force assembled from at least 3 separate organizational lineages: his own airborne division, an armored combat command with no prior operational history alongside the paratroopers, and a tank destroyer battalion attached on short notice, none of whom had trained together or developed the kind of standing coordination procedures a more conventionally assembled defense would have had time to build. By noon that day, German forces were closing from 3 directions simultaneously: the 26th Volksgrenadiers infiltrating from south and east, Panzer Lehr pressing from the east, elements of 2nd Panzer threatening from the north. The last open road into Bastogne, toward Neufchâteau, was cut by midday. Captain Richard Winters of Easy Company, 506 PIR, positioned his men along the perimeter in foxholes dug with helmets and bare hands once standard entrenching tools broke against the frozen ground, the temperature already near zero. The town's roughly 3,000 civilians sheltered in cellars as German artillery began methodically reducing Bastogne itself. Renée Lemaire, a 30-year-old Belgian nurse, worked continuously at the aid station on the Rue Neufchâteau, treating both American and German wounded. She would not survive the siege. By the time the perimeter stabilized, the garrison numbered roughly 18,000. The 101st Airborne's 11,840, Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division under Colonel William Roberts, with some 40 operational tanks and 2,800 men, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, with its M18 Hellcats, the all-black 969th Field Artillery Battalion, and assorted support units. December 21st brought visibility under 100 yards, as thick fog mixed with snow created what the Army's own meteorological report described as conditions extremely adverse for any military operation, a description that applied with equal force to both sides, though the consequences cut in opposite directions. For the Germans, the weather grounded the Allied fighter bombers that had savaged their columns relentlessly since D-Day. Oberleutnant von Lau of the 2nd Panzer Division noted, with what reads as genuine relief, that without Allied aircraft, the Americans were simply men, like the Germans, and the Germans had more tanks. But German armor was simultaneously bogging in the mud produced by alternating freeze and thaw cycles, doubling fuel consumption as engines worked harder through the mire, while supply trucks jackknifed on icy roads, and wounded men froze before aid could reach them. The same weather imposing real costs on the besieging force, even as it removed the Allied air threat from the equation. The medical situation inside the perimeter had a specific structural cause beyond simple wartime scarcity. A forward medical company supporting the 101st Airborne had been captured intact by advancing German forces on December 19th. Removing in a single stroke a substantial fraction of the division's planned surgical and pharmaceutical capacity before the siege proper had even fully closed around the town. What remained had to absorb the entire garrison's casualty load for the following week. Inside Bastogne's shrinking perimeter, the supply situation had become genuinely desperate. Artillery was rationed to 10 rounds per gun per day. Medical supplies, already badly depleted after the capture of that forward company, had reached the point that morphine could be reserved only for the most severe wounds. Food had dropped to 1K ration per man per day, roughly 2,800 calories against the 4,000 or more the extreme cold actually demanded. Private First Class James Sims later described frostbite cases reaching the point where frozen feet came off with boots when medics finally cut them away, the men beyond the point of feeling it happen. Technical Sergeant Donald Malarkey recalled a specific improvisation that emerged from the food shortage rather than any official supply solution. Hundreds of dead German horses, frozen solid, provided fresh meat that men hacked free with bayonets and cooked over fires built from broken ammunition crates. Edible, by his own account barely, but sufficient to keep men functioning. The cold itself produced casualties at a rate separate from and roughly comparable to enemy action across the siege's worst days. Unit medical logs from the period, compiled in post-war Army studies of the campaign, record trench foot and frostbite cases running at a pace that strained the already depleted medical capacity nearly as severely as combat wounds did, a category of casualty that German formations attacking through the same weather were absorbing in parallel, if anything at a comparable or higher rate given their longer, continuous exposure outside fixed defensive positions. Back at Verdun, the order Eisenhower had given on December 19th set in motion logistics on a scale that the conventional planning timeline considered close to impossible inside the window available. Patton's prearranged code phrase to his own headquarters, "play ball," triggered the movement of roughly 133,000 vehicles north within hours, the full reorientation of Third Army's 250,000 men, the relocation of supply dumps originally positioned for a continued push into Germany, the relaying of some 20,000 miles of telephone wire, and a complete recalculation of artillery firing data for guns whose positions had been surveyed for an entirely different axis of fire. The scale of the wire-laying figure deserves a moment's specific attention, because it represents work that had to be performed by hand, by Signal Corps personnel physically stringing cable along roadsides under the same winter conditions, slowing every other element of the movement. Each artillery battalion required its own dedicated communication network, linking forward observers to fire direction centers, and none of that infrastructure could simply be repointed. It had to be physically relayed along the new axis of advance, in the dark, in temperatures that made handling bare wire and connectors a genuinely hazardous task on its own, before any enemy contact entered the equation. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division, received movement orders at 7 p.m. on December 19th, requiring his unit to cover 150 miles in 19 hours through an active blizzard. His own account describes tank commanders standing exposed in their turrets through the night, guiding drivers who could not see the road by blacked-out lights alone, men falling asleep upright at their posts and having to be physically shaken back to alertness. The fuel arithmetic alone was formidable. Each Sherman required roughly 175 gallons for the journey, putting the division's total requirement at approximately 50,000 gallons before it had covered a single mile of actual combat ground, with fuel trucks sliding off icy roads into ditches regularly enough that crews resorted to hand-transferring fuel via 5-gallon jerry cans when a truck could not be recovered in time. Master Sergeant Frank Carosella of the division's maintenance company described changing track blocks on tanks while they continued rolling into position, men's hands freezing to bare metal hard enough that skin came away when they pulled free, and continuing the work anyway, on the explicit understanding that paratroopers in Bastogne were depending on the schedule being met. The movement's command and control challenge compounded the purely mechanical difficulty. Third Army staff had to coordinate the simultaneous redirection of 3 full divisions along overlapping road networks already congested with retreating elements of other American formations fleeing the initial German breakthrough, while maintaining the artillery and supply coordination each division needed to fight effectively the moment it reached contact, a level of simultaneous traffic management that, under the prevailing weather and road conditions, several staff officers privately doubted could be accomplished without serious collisions or units arriving badly out of sequence with their supporting arms. At 11:30 a.m. on December 22nd, 4 German officers approached the American lines south of Bastogne under a white flag, met by soldiers of F Company, 327th Glider Infantry Regiment. The party, Major Wagner of the 47th Panzer Corps, Lieutenant Helmut Henke of the Panzer Operations Section, and 2 enlisted men, carried a typed ultimatum in 2 language versions, the English copy produced on a German typewriter, with diacritical marks added afterward by hand. McAuliffe, asleep on a brief break in the basement of the Belgian barracks serving as his headquarters, was woken by Lieutenant Colonel Ned Moore with the news that the Germans had sent a party forward demanding surrender. His first response, by every account from the room, was a single unscripted word: nuts. When the staff gathered to draft a formal written reply, McAuliffe genuinely paused over what to write, and Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kimmert suggested that what he had already said would be hard to improve on. McAuliffe laughed, confirmed he meant exactly that word, and wrote the reply that went back to the German officers under the same white flag: nuts. From the American commander. Colonel Joseph Harper, delivering the response personally, found the German officers genuinely confused about what the single word meant. Harper's clarification was direct. It means go to hell, and if you attack again, we will kill every German who tries to break into this town. Major Wagner's reply, stiff with formal correctness, promised heavy American casualties as the inevitable cost of continued resistance. Harper's only further comment was, "On your way, and good luck to you." General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding 5th Panzer Army overall, later admitted in post-war interrogation that he had been surprised the ultimatum was sent at all. Panzerlehr's local commander had dispatched the parlementaire without his authorization, and the refusal, in Manteuffel's own words, was exactly what should have been expected. The German response to the refusal arrived that same evening, the Luftwaffe's first major bombing raid on Bastogne itself. Corporal Walter Gordon of Easy Company described the ground shaking like an earthquake, trees igniting, shrapnel tearing through the dark while men pressed themselves flat into frozen earth. Temperatures fell to near 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Men in the perimeter foxholes took turns sleeping to avoid freezing, and learned to relieve themselves into empty ration cans rather than expose themselves outside cover even briefly, since a few minutes' exposure could mean death from sniper fire or frostbite alike. December 24th brought both genuine hope and a specific horror in close sequence. Clearing weather raised the prospect of aerial resupply for the first time in days, and simultaneously gave the Luftwaffe a final opportunity for its most damaging raid of the siege. At 8:30 p.m. on Christmas Eve, German bombers scored a direct hit on the aid station where René Lemaire continued working. The building collapsed, trapping dozens of wounded soldiers and medical staff beneath the rubble. Corporal Kenneth Moore, outside when the bomb struck, described digging through the night with bare hands toward voices calling from beneath the wreckage. Lemaire died in the collapse, having stayed specifically because the patients in her care could not be moved. Roughly 30 American soldiers died in that single raid. Augusta Chewy, a Congolese-Belgian nurse who survived the same bombing, continued treating wounded for 30 consecutive hours afterward. Patton's relief column, meanwhile, was running behind the schedule he had promised Eisenhower. By Christmas Eve, the 4th Armored Division had advanced only 7 miles in 3 days against determined German resistance and the same weather punishing both sides. Patton, characteristically unwilling to treat the problem as purely a military one, summoned his chaplain, Colonel James O'Neill, on December 22nd with an explicit request for a printed prayer for clear weather, tired, in his own phrasing, of his soldiers fighting mud and floods on top of Germans. O'Neill's doubts about the theological propriety of the request did not stop Patton from having it printed on 250,000 cards and distributed across the entire Third Army. December 23rd dawned clear. After a week of impenetrable fog and snow, visibility extended to 10 miles, and the temperature climbed above freezing for the first time since the offensive began. Whether through coincidence or something Patton would have credited otherwise, the weather break arrived at the precise moment Allied air power needed it most. At 9:50 a.m., the first Pathfinder aircraft appeared over Bastogne, marking drop zones with colored smoke. By 11:50 a.m., the sky held 241 C-47 transports in formation. Sergeant Jack Agnew of the Pathfinder team described the moment the low rumble grew into a roar and the sky turned dark with aircraft. What he called, without apparent exaggeration, the most beautiful sight he had ever seen. Inside the perimeter, men climbed from foxholes, waving helmets, some openly weeping after a week of believing themselves entirely alone. The drop itself required a specific kind of vulnerability that the C-47 crews accepted without the option of any meaningful evasive maneuver. Accurate parachute delivery into a perimeter as compressed as Bastogne's by this point in the siege demanded straight, level flight at roughly 1,000 feet, an altitude and flight profile that made each aircraft an effectively stationary target for German anti-aircraft positions ringing the town, with no room to jink or climb away from fire without scattering the supply bundles outside the perimeter the troops on the ground actually controlled. Of 1,446 supply bundles dropped that day, roughly 95% were successfully recovered despite the German fire. Captain James Parker, coordinating recovery for the division's logistics section, described soldiers running through active artillery fire to retrieve bundles, one private continuing to drag a bundle to cover after taking shrapnel and still bleeding heavily. The resupply effort continued and expanded across the following days as the weather held. By December 26th, the combined airlift had delivered 1,020.7 tons by parachute and a further 92.4 tons by glider. Gliders offering the specific advantage of bringing in cargo too large or fragile for a parachute drop, including, in several documented instances, surgical teams and equipment that needed to land intact rather than absorb a parachute descent's impact. The single largest day of the operation came on December 26th, when 289 aircraft flew what crews referred to afterwards simply as the Bastogne run. The resupply effort by that point running in close coordination with the ground relief column approaching from the south, rather than as the garrison's sole remaining lifeline. Christmas morning brought the German offensive's most determined attempt to break the perimeter before relief could arrive. At 2:45 a.m., the heaviest artillery barrage of the siege fell on Bastogne for 2 continuous hours. At 5:30 a.m., 18 Panzer Mark V tanks of the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, accompanied by infantry in white winter camouflage, struck the western perimeter under orders from General Kokot that were explicit about the political stakes attached. Bastogne must fall today, as the Führer's Christmas wish. German armor broke through the first line of foxholes held by Company A, 327 Glider Infantry. Private First Class Kenneth Hendricks, positioned in the second line, described the ground shaking from approaching engines and the specific failure of bazooka rounds bouncing off frontal armor in the half-light. The attack's timing reflected genuine desperation on the German side, rather than confident operational planning. By Christmas morning, von Ludwitz's corps had been fighting continuously for 6 days against a position his original orders had assumed would fall within 48 hours. And intelligence reaching German headquarters about Patton's relief force already moving north made clear that whatever assault was going to break Bastogne needed to succeed immediately or not at all. The choice to attack on Christmas specifically, rather than waiting even a single additional day to better coordinate the assault, reads in retrospect as a decision driven by a closing window rather than tactical preference. What broke the attack was a tank destroyer ambush positioned in advance rather than improvised under fire. M18 Hellcats of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, concealed inside rubbled buildings along the German axis of advance, let the panzer column pass before opening fire from the flanks, into armor that was considerably thinner at the side and rear than across the glacis plate the attackers had been built to survive frontal engagement against. Sergeant Bill Harper, commanding one of the Hellcats, described his gunner Corporal Johnson firing 5 shots for 3 confirmed kills. By 10 a.m., all 18 German tanks were burning wrecks, and roughly 400 German infantry lay dead in the snow. The captured German officer told his interrogators afterward that the defense had been magnificent enough to convince his unit, by that single morning's outcome alone, that Bastogne could not be taken. Several prisoners taken that morning reportedly carried personal letters home, already written in anticipation of the town's capture, dated for delivery once the offensive's broader objectives had been secured. Correspondence that post-war archivists found undelivered among captured German mail sacks, never sent because the assumption behind them never came true. December 26th, 4 p.m. Lieutenant Charles Boggess, commanding the Sherman tank Cobra King of the 37th Tank Battalion, watched through his periscope as his column approached the Belgian village of Eisenhower, 4 miles from Bastogne, after 4 days fighting through German positions at the pace of yards rather than miles at a time. The final push began at 2:20 p.m. when Abrams ordered the battalion forward behind everything available in supporting artillery. Roughly 2,340 rounds landing on German positions around the village in a concentrated barrage before the armor moved. Boggess described German troops breaking from their foxholes as the artillery walked across their positions, and the order to move out the instant the barrage lifted. Private James Hendricks, the bow gunner and Cobra King, recalled the column going through Eisenhower like a knife through butter, while German fire came from windows and doorways in every direction, and the tank's main gun traversed continuously, firing point-blank into building after building. At 4:50 p.m., Boggess crested a low rise and saw American soldiers ahead of him, engineers of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion, the outermost ring of Bastogne's own defenses, shouting that his was the first tank they had seen in 10 days. The siege had broken, through a corridor only some 400 yards wide and at considerable cost. The 37th Tank Battalion alone lost 5 killed, 22 wounded, and 5 missing in the final breakthrough. The 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion suffered roughly 30 killed and 180 wounded reaching the town. Men inside Bastogne, who had spent days conserving every round, fired entire clips into the air in celebration once word of the breakthrough spread. McAuliffe's own response to the relief column was characteristically understated. "Glad to see you, boys." General Major Cocot's diary entry from the same hours reads as something closer to a private admission of defeat than a tactical assessment. The relief of Bastogne, in his own words, represented a disaster not merely tactically but morally. German soldiers having seen American determination in a form that had broken their own confidence in the offensive's eventual success. The siege's full cost, tallied afterward, runs in both directions. American casualties at Bastogne across the period totaled roughly 4,500, with the 101st Airborne's losses from December 19th through January 6th reaching 341 killed, 1,691 wounded, and 516 missing. Combat Command B added roughly 500 further casualties, while the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion destroyed 108 German armored vehicles against the loss of 17 of its own Hellcats. German losses around the town ran substantially heavier in proportion to the forces committed. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division suffered over 60% casualties. Panzer Lehr lost 42 tanks, and 2nd Panzer Division, having bypassed Bastogne entirely to drive toward the Meuse, ran out of fuel barely 4 miles short of the river, and was destroyed there by the U.S. 2nd Armored Division, a separate but directly related collapse of the broader offensive's logistics that the Bastogne delay had helped produce. From December 23rd through the 27th, with clear weather finally sustaining continuous Allied air operations, Allied aircraft flew more than 34,000 sorties. The Luftwaffe, which had committed roughly 2,000 aircraft to supporting the offensive at its opening, had fewer than 300 operational by the week's end. The single most destructive Allied air action came on December 26th, when 294 RAF Lancaster bombers struck German positions around Saint-Vit, dropping 1,140 tons of bombs and rendering every road within roughly 3 kilometers impassable. Unteroffizier Hans Baron of the 18th Volksgrenadier Division, who survived the raid in a shelter, described emerging afterward to what he called a moonscape. Buildings disintegrated, men he had been standing near simply gone. What German officers wrote and said in the immediate aftermath, separate from the wider propaganda apparatus still functioning behind them, is more analytically useful than the symbolic value the single word nuts eventually accumulated in American popular memory. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, in a letter recovered from his body, wrote to his wife on December 24th that the Americans were not what German training had described, that he had personally watched a single machine gun crew hold off an entire company for 3 hours. Major Hans Kag of Panzer Lehr, captured on December 27th, told interrogators directly that the Germans had lost at Bastogne not through any deficiency in numbers or equipment, but through something closer to spirit, the specific discovery that the soldiers opposing them were, in his own framing, warriors rather than the demoralized conscripts German wartime propaganda had promised them. Field Marshal Gerhard von Rundstedt, overall German commander in the West, offered a more operationally precise post-war assessment. Bastogne, in his words, became the graveyard of the Ardennes offensive, specifically because the road junction was needed by December 18th, and once the Americans held it for a week and then received reinforcement, the wider operation's failure was effectively settled regardless of what happened on any other sector of the front. Germany had committed its entire remaining strategic reserve, some 25 divisions, to the offensive. Across 6 weeks of fighting, it suffered between 81,000 and 98,000 casualties, lost more than 600 tanks and assault guns, and roughly 1,000 aircraft. Losses the German war economy by this stage had no realistic capacity to replace. American losses across the broader Bulge fighting ran to roughly 75,000 killed, wounded, or missing, including some 19,000 dead. Severe by any measure, but absorbed by a replacement and production system still bringing fresh divisions from the United States at a rate of roughly one per week by January 1945. When Soviet forces launched their own winter offensive on January 12, 1945, Germany had no strategic reserve remaining to shift east to meet it, a direct consequence of the reserve already spent and lost in the Ardennes. The specific causal chain connecting Bastogne's stand to that broader strategic outcome deserves stating plainly rather than left implicit. It was not the size of the German losses at Bastogne alone that mattered, since the town's immediate garrison and the corps besieging it represented a relatively small fraction of the overall forces committed to the offensive. What mattered was the schedule. Every additional day the road junction remained in American hands was a day German armor elsewhere on the front could not be resupplied or reinforced through it. A day the broader offensive's timetable slipped further behind the narrow window during which winter weather was expected to ground Allied air power, and a day closer to the clear skies that, once they arrived on December 23rd, exposed every German formation still on the wrong side of the Meuse to exactly the kind of air interdiction the entire operation had been planned to avoid. Patton's relief, considered on its own terms separate from the siege it ended, remains one of the more thoroughly documented examples of rapid, large-scale military reorientation in the 20th century. Colonel Oscar Koch, Patton's intelligence officer, wrote afterward that the movement should, by conventional planning standards, have required a minimum of 6 days simply to organize, a timeline Patton's prior, unauthorized contingency planning had effectively compressed into the available 3. Koch's specific point, made repeatedly in his post-war writing on the operation, was that the bottleneck conventional doctrine assumed would govern such a movement was never raw transport capacity, but the planning phase itself, survey, sequencing, and coordination between divisions sharing overlapping road networks, and that no staff he had previously studied or served on had compressed that planning phase into anything close to 72 hours before. The medical effort sustaining the siege deserves separate recognition from the combat narrative that usually absorbs most of the attention. Major René Bowman, chief surgeon for the 101st Airborne, performed 167 operations across 10 days, frequently without proper anesthetic once morphine ran short, operating by candlelight when generators failed, and using requisitioned Belgian cognac as a substitute when nothing else was available. Technical Sergeant Eugene Rowe of Easy Company treated more than 200 wounded men during the siege, repeatedly crawling forward under artillery fire to reach casualties while carrying no weapon of his own, only medical supplies. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's own post-war assessment credited the American stand at Bastogne as one of the finest individual chapters of the entire war's military history. Winston Churchill, addressing Parliament in January 1945, called it without qualification the greatest American battle of the war. Perhaps the most striking post-war tribute came from von Ludwitz himself, the Corps commander whose forces had delivered the original surrender ultimatum, who returned to the Bastogne Memorial in 1954 and offered a verdict notably free of the rancor a defeated commander might be expected to carry. The men who had refused his demand, in his own assessment, deserved their victory because they had fought for a principle rather than for conquest. McAuliffe himself went on to lead the 101st Airborne for the remainder of the war, later commanded American forces in Europe during the early Cold War years, and retired a full general in 1956. He was asked across more than 2 decades of subsequent interviews the same question in slightly different forms, whether he had given any real thought to the reply before writing it. His answer remained essentially consistent throughout. The word had not been chosen for its rhetorical effect at all, simply because it was the honest, immediate response of a man who had genuinely not considered surrender as one of the available options in the first place. Patton, by contrast, treated the relief march itself with characteristic showmanship even in the moment, visiting forward units personally during the movement north, in at least one documented instance personally directing traffic at a congested crossroads to keep the column moving on schedule, a level of direct, visible involvement in logistics that few Army commanders of his seniority considered part of their job. The town itself rebuilt in the years following the war, with the specific historical weight of the siege embedded into its physical landscape, rather than simply commemorated separately from it. A preserved foxhole on a hill outside town, maintained as close as practical to its December 1944 condition, remains one of the more visited sites associated with the battle. A small, unglamorous depression in frozen ground that, more than any single statistic from the broader campaign, conveys what 18 days of siege actually looked like at the level of an individual soldier, with no information beyond what he could see from his own position, and no certainty, until the morning of December 26th, that relief was actually coming, rather than simply being promised. After retiring as a brigadier general, Koch went on to teach intelligence analysis, using the Ardennes warning specifically as a case study in how correct assessments fail to change institutional behavior until the cost of ignoring them has already been paid. If accounts like this one, the logistics, the weather, and the unglamorous mechanics behind a single famous word are worth your time, a subscribe and a like help this kind of detail reach more people.